All beginnings are difficult, aren't they? It's hard to get started, as the saying goes. And I'm not talking about the situation when you take on a leadership role for the first time as a manager, but about switching between different leadership roles. As a rule, you don't remain the leader of the same team for the rest of your life. You change, you get promoted, you quit, and then you start somewhere else. You get a new team. A change can happen relatively often, usually every 3 years. When you change, you are the new person, and not only as a manager. You don't know the others, but they know each other. That's the problem. Now, of course, you can start out the way a lot of executives do, and the way I definitely used to. Here it goes. I know it. I can do it. After all, I'm a leader. I'm the boss. I'm going to tell you how it's done. I posterize a little bit. Of course, not all of us do it that way, but I've made this mistake a time or two. Fortunately, at some point, I changed the procedure. So, after my predecessor introduced me in the team meeting or in the division meeting, I say a few warm words about myself, about what my plans are, and then I always add, so I'm going to talk to each of you privately. That's why you're all going to get an invitation in the next few days. My recommendation is to have no more than 2 or a maximum of 4 conversations per day. Granted, this takes a relatively long time with, let's say, 150 co-workers, but I still wouldn't recommend more interviews per day. Why? Because you'll be flat. At least that's how I felt. After the 4th interview at the latest, you're no longer truly receptive, and the interviews, they last between 45 and 90 minutes. I wouldn't shorten them either. I've never done that. The interview always begins in the same way and then proceeds differently depending on the person. As a manager, I always start with a brief introduction of myself. I include who I am, where I come from, and that I will ask 2 questions at the end. I explain that this is why there are post-it notes and a Sharpie here. I then explain that I would now like to know who they are. How long have they been working here? What do they do here? And why do they do it at all? For example, if I'm interested in my colleague who is a controller, I'll ask, how long have you been a controller here? Why did you apply for this position with this company? Why controlling at all? Why didn't you become a developer? These questions help us understand why people are the way they are. Of course, I always add, we don't need to talk about pure business. I'm also interested in your personal interests. However, I don't want to be so nosy that people feel pressure to tell me private things they don't want to say either. A nice little story. There's one thing a co-worker once told me that stuck with me in one of these interviews. 2 sad incidents happened in 1 year. Both her father and her mother-in-law passed away. Since they all got along very well, she said that it resulted in a very interesting combination over time. Her mother is now married to her husband's father. These are things that life writes and that you would probably only find out in such a conversation. It's exciting, as you can see. I remember this interesting incident, and it felt like an excellent example of how these questions can bring us closer to our co-workers. Then, as a manager, I always ask the 2 questions I mentioned at the beginning. Remember? That is, what is the company's strategy? In 1 sentence, please. The other question is, what 2 things could you change if you could? And write all 3 things down on 2 pieces of paper, please. Why? Well, I need this later, so I don't forget anything, because I also want to cluster them. Remember, I have up to 150 interviews, because I want to present them again in a team meeting so I can follow up. I can give an update on what feedback I've received from my colleagues and obviously what I want to do with them. As you see, strategy is extremely important to me. You'll always find that if you have 100 people, there are 50 different strategies. And that tells you there's either no consistent strategy, it's not communicated properly, or it's not understood properly. That's when I know what I need to do as a leader. The second question tells you what your coworker think is needed to make things better. You get feedback, of course, like, I give myself a raise, or I give myself 6 weeks of vacation right now. That does happen, but I usually delegate those kinds of things, if it's not my direct co-worker, to their direct supervisor. That's where it belongs. However, if I'm their direct supervisor now, which happens in these conversations, then we discuss it at the appropriate time. In a get-to-know-you meeting, no one gets promoted, nor do they get approved of vacation or training, right? But you learn also things like, we should introduce remote work, or the air on the second floor is so bad, or the windows are leaking and it's always cold in winter or hot in summer. We need new company cars, new computers, the process is broken, everybody should have laptops, and so forth. That is fantastic. And why is that fantastic? Because here, as a leader, you get an insanely good list of things that need to be done, or at least that your co-workers think need to be done. You can now put them in order, and then you have a reasonable plan right at the beginning that you know your co-workers support. Now, you will probably say they want a lot from their managers. You can't fulfill all of the wishes they have. That's sort of true. But by asking, by them telling you and communicating and giving an update on the coming weeks, and this is my recommendation, you've shown them. You can listen, you are appreciative, you can implement things. And what I always do as a leader then, I take the list to hand and directly implement the easy things that also seem logical to me. Of course, you need to deal with the things that you think are good, but not easy to implement. Re-evaluate those items to decide whether you can, should, or even want to do them. Place those in the "we'll have another look at that" category. Give feedback to your co-workers that they are now in the "we'll have another look at that" category. And finally, there's the great ideas that will unfortunately never be able to implement category. Because sometimes there are things that you have to admit aren't just possible. For instance, everybody should get a laptop right now. That's a kind of in-between thing. Yes, we will do that in the future, but not now. This is because you have 200 co-workers. You have to buy 200 laptops in one swoop. They are not in the current budget, and in this case, everyone has a desktop PC. You would have to write them all off. Of course, that doesn't make sense either. You can explain that very well. This information helps you as a leader in the next team meetings or in the area meetings or stand-ups or whatever you do to give an update on what you're doing with the feedback that your co-workers have given you. You get to know the co-workers, you get to appreciate them, and it gives you a great start with enough time to understand how this works the way it does. And before you intervene, think about where your intervention is needed. Thank you.